succeed at sometimes. We bring together leaders in situations exactly like this. We have one of our young leaders right here. Policymakers, professionals, to exchange views and share experiences in areas of mutual concern, like this one, which, as some of you may know, we've been running cyber programs for quite some time. I think this was our 4th year this fall, and one of the subjects in the cyber conference that we had in Washington with a pretty distinguished group of people, I think. The former head of NATO has 2 Supreme Allied Commanders. One of them, General Palomares, a Frenchman, was there. Admiral Rogers from the NSA was there. He is a superstar, and hopefully Trump will pick him for something. I would pick him for something if I had something to offer. He's amazing. Thank you all for coming. We want to thank the Lounsbury Foundation for supporting this effort. Cybersecurity was the subject of our conference, cyber terrorism. And people said, well, you know, terrorists will attack infrastructure. And then people started saying, well, what is the most important infrastructure that we have? And it is, of course, the electoral process. So tonight, we have some experts who I've been speaking to before Eva came to talk about our vulnerabilities. I mean, we seem to be of 2 kinds. One is purely technical. You vote and not change your vote through electronic means. The other seems even simpler. I just put out a lot of disinformation about the candidate. Like, I was just hearing that Alain Juppé, one of our young leaders, got the moniker of Ali Juppé and was unable to get out from under it. And of course, the Muslim problem in France is not something you want to be attached to. So now we have feeling. But disinformation, which is of course been going on for decades, and the Gulf countries practice it in other countries, is pretty simple. And I don't know how you stop that with First Amendment rights here. And I think as you try to stop it, whoever says that's a lie, people don't believe them either. So in any event, I don't know anything about this, but we're going to learn from the panel. Scott Handler, who is at West Point. I told him, where's your uniform? He's the military intelligence officer, a cyber warfare officer. He was a White House fellow. He was special advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. And of course, he's a French-American Foundation young leader. And he recently became a member of the board of directors. So I'm going to get out of Scott's way and let him pick up. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, everybody. Don't feel shy in the back. You can also feel free to move forward since we have some space for the other parts. What we're looking for today, I think, is that's just even the topic itself, right? Rigging the election is provocative in its own point because of a lot of things that we saw from this election. But it's nothing necessarily new about the ideas of what comes to a rigging of the election. But I think that Alan and the French-American team and others who invited our panelists today really brought together the right mix of people to talk about, as Alan said, this framing of the issue of rigging an election. What are the perspectives that we can take? And so before I introduce the panel members, that's why they were really selected, to be able to talk about it from different perspectives. So Susan's going to end up being able to talk to from this technological standpoint, and I'll introduce Susan in a moment. Damien from the idea of informational means and delivery of the information, or misinformation, or propaganda, or accurate information potentially as well. And then the role of foreign actors, that especially because of this election and the role that Russia predominantly played, at least rhetorically, and was brought into it. And we'll talk about the role Russia played and what motives or other parts of what Kimberly will be able to really help us dive into and see the complexity of this part of rigging this election, but then broaden it out to other areas of future and looking forward to what's about to happen in the European elections that are about to take place. And again, role of Russia, an important part of it potentially that's there, or at least they're in concern with what's going on in Western Europe. But then also look back a little bit too, and what's new per se, is it the means themselves, but again, are states always involved in trying to influence other elections? What would it look like, but what is the concerns too about technological changes and that impact potentially on election systems themselves? Because people have tried to rig elections for a long time, right? Even go back to Nixon, Kennedy, and believing that potentially Mayor Daley, turned the vote and rigging the election, right? That all of those concerns have always been there. So we'll talk about what it means for this century to do that. With that as a basic framing, also the other part of the news, we'll have about 45 minutes of a moderated Q&A, but given the size of the group, feel free to also partake, but then we'll open it up to everybody to discuss as well and have parts of questions that you have along the way to please feel free. First, though, I want to introduce parts, my far left, your far right on the table here. Susan Greenhalgh, sorry. That serves as, I finally got at least Susan right. I kept calling her Sarah earlier, I don't know why in my head. But Susan is an election specialist at Verified Voting's initiative to protect elections in the era of cyber attacks. She's performed extensive research for a long time now, well over a decade in this area, looking at the idea of federal policies regarding voting over the internet, the impact of those different policies as well as state policies, worked with cybersecurity experts and advisors at the federal level to bridge the gap between national cybersecurity policy with the different election administrations that we have in a decentralized manner in this country. In 2006, she worked closely on a project with CNN called Democracy at Risk, and at that time was looking at a series of reports on voting system integrity, and we'll talk a little bit about that period as well. On my left, right directly to me, your right, Damien Leloup, is the editor of Pixels, which is part of Le Monde, which covers the digital revolution. He studied American history and literature in France at Rennes University, and then also graduated from École Supérieure de Journalism in Lille before starting at Le Monde in 2006. So I've been there for a while, and then was a deputy editor-in-chief before founding Pixels as this part of the digital revolution, which looks at things beyond not just purely elections, but privacy, freedoms of expression, digital policies, anything digital looks at in that concern. And then on my right, your left, Kimberly Martin. Kimberly is Ann Whitney Olin Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, as well as Director of the Program on U.S.-Russia Relations at Columbia's Harriman Institute. And then she also sometimes occasionally teaches a course at the School of International and Public Affairs here at Columbia University as well. She's written 4 books, most recently Warlords, Strong-Arm Brokers, and Weak States. And her first book was Engaging the Enemy, Organization Theory and Soviet Military Innovation, which won the Marshall Schulman Prize. Frequent media contributor or commentator, and even when Jon Stewart was still there, appeared on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. All right, with the introductions set to the side to begin this conversation.
Can you speak into the microphone?
So the camera, can everybody,
Yes.
not here, sorry, thanks, Dana. There we go. All right, so it don't cause any problems here. Can you hear everybody here?
Yes.
Dana, good, all right. And keep me on track if you can. So the 2016 election, let's start with that point. What I'd like to do is first talk, an interesting thing that's happened in the last couple of days is the Democrats in Congress have proposed potentially holding a commission to look at the role Russia has played in the United States election, even gaining some potential bipartisan support for that to look at what that role is. So to look at it in these different aspects, I want to start really with Kimberly, because Russia was the framed group behind everything that took place in the 2016 election, and depending on how you listen to it, Russia and President Putin elected Donald Trump, right? So given that as a way that it's potentially been framed, let's explore it a little bit, and why would Russia want to influence America's election, and what would be some of the motives that President Putin in particular would have?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Scott. I think what we have to keep in mind is that many people believe that we are in information war with Russia. This didn't start just with the election. It's been going on ever since the intervention in Ukraine started in early 2014. Information war in Russia is a very broad spectrum kind of approach to unconventional conflict. It ranges from lots of disinformation, which is one of the things we've been talking about, to hacking and other forms of intervention in cyber questions, to things like using special operations forces to make it appear as if rioting is happening in a nearby country that is domestically caused when in fact it is being sparked by Russian special operations forces who are pretending to be locals. All of those things are on the spectrum of what Russia calls information warfare. Now, in terms of Russian motives, I think there's a huge amount being made of the idea that Russia wants to undermine our democracy, or that Russia wanted to see Donald Trump elected. And those are both possibilities. But the truth is, even if we know that Russia, through the means of Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, did in fact hack the emails and therefore did have some kind of a role in what was happening in the US electoral process, it's a big leap to say, therefore, Russia's intentions were the following. And I think one thing that we need to keep in mind about Vladimir Putin is that he is an opportunist and a tactician. So rather than having some grand strategic nefarious plan, which is what a lot of people attribute to him, what he is a former KGB officer, lifelong KGB officer, no such thing as former when you're talking about the KGB, they say, who likes trying things and seeing what happens. And in fact, the Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear technology that was used against the emails in the United States was identical to the technology that was used against the Chinese military. So they were not very discerning in their targets. And my best guess about what happened is this. Everybody in Russia believed that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. I was there at a conference in April, and that's what I heard from everybody. And the Americans were trying to say, oh, a lot can happen between now and then. And they were saying, oh, no, it's all fixed. Hillary's going to win, right? So if you think that Hillary Clinton is going to win the election, and if you're Vladimir Putin and you're angry at Hillary Clinton because you think she had something to do with the protests against you in 2011 and 2012, you just want to get her. Right? Maybe you want to get her to disrupt the American political system. Maybe you want to get her to show her that you can get her. Maybe you want to get her just to sort of send a shot across the bow and say, look, when you're president, if you try to do something against me, just remember what I can do against you. We don't know what the motives were, even though we know that Russia did try to get involved.
Thanks. So a couple things. So Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear. Fancy Bear is the GRU, which is the military intelligence arm of Russia. And then Cozy Bear is the FSB, which is a successor to the KGB. And those are code names that the cyber community and sorts have named on different elements, just like everything that has panda is China, bear is Russia, so there's different, I forget what Iran was nicknamed
What are
as.
we?
Hmm?
What are we? Eagle.
Well, since we don't do anything right.
Voice of America.
But everything we do right would be fine, right? And we don't get involved in others' elections. I'm joking, right? Because Putin would say, right, that we did. So actually, though, there's a point from that what you mentioned about Ukraine that I want to draw in Susan on, because Ukrainian involvement and concerns that Russia has had and everything else there. In the 2014 election came into being that Ukraine tried to hack into the system, or influence the systems, right?
Russia actually hacked into the Ukrainian election system.
So Russia hacked their system at that point in time, and so there was evidence of a pattern of a way to be able to do it. Can you explain what happened then? And then is there any evidence to support whether Russia has potentially hacked into the U.S. system in this process?
Sure.
In 2016.
Thank you very much. So the Ukrainian attack, or the Ukrainian election hack, occurred between the results being reported from the various local districts and the central computer. And there was, I think it was a man-in-the-middle attack where they got in and they changed their results before they were going to be reported. But the Ukrainian government actually caught it. And before the results were made public, they were able to go back and reconstruct the results correctly by going to the individual jurisdictions and getting the correct totals and tallying them up themselves. So what was actually reported was correct. And there was no improper person being awarded the presidency. But interestingly, the Russian news, RT television or RT News, reported the results that were the false results that never made it to public from the Ukrainian public website. So there is evidence of Russians going and using technology and hacking to change election results and install their favored candidate in an election that they consider to be important to them. As far as the U.S. election at this point, there's a difficulty to gather evidence unless you actually go and look at the evidence, which is what the Stein campaign is trying to do by looking at the paper ballots in Wisconsin and Michigan and doing a recount and forensic analysis in Pennsylvania where they don't have paper ballots to go back and recount. So they would be, if there was some sort of manipulation of the election results, it would be sort of on the same model of the Ukrainian election where the computerized results may, if they were manipulated, it would give you the wrong result, and the point of the recount is to go back and construct the correct count from the paper ballots. But there was one other aspect of your question that I wanted, that I was going to address, and now it went out of my head. If I just,
Well,
Do you
it comes
remember-
back in, so.
if it comes back in, okay.
Because it was the 2014 part, and then there's
Oh,
evidence
yep.
of similarity to.
Yeah, now I remember now. So in addition, as far as evidence going, in addition to the hacking that Kimberly mentioned of the DNC, which is very widely known, there was also hacking into the voter registration databases, and that is not so widely known. Over 20 states were attacked by foreign actors. That was attributed to the Russians. The U.S. Federal intelligence agencies never officially named the Russians as being responsible for that. As many as 4 states were actually infiltrated. 2 states were named, Arizona and Illinois, and 200,000 voter records were exfiltrated, which means they were taken out, copied from the Illinois voter registration database. So the evidence goes a little bit further than just sort of the informational wars, but into actually trying to attack voting infrastructure. In addition to the voter registration databases, there was a vendor in Florida that is responsible for maintaining voter registration databases and also what's known as electronic poll books or e-poll books. And if you're from New York, we don't have them, so you went in to vote and signed your name on a paper book. But some states have an electronic poll book, which is a laptop computer or a tablet, and the voter rolls are maintained in electronic form in that device, and the voters go in and sign in that. So the vendor that was hacked in Florida, the federal government found out about it because they monitor things that go on the dark web, informed the state of Florida and the vendor. And the vendor supplied systems to Florida and also to 6 other states, including Durham County, North Carolina. And they supplied the e-poll books for Durham County, North Carolina. And some people may know that on election day, from opening of polls, the e-poll books crashed across the entire county of Durham County, North Carolina. And voters, in many cases, were sent away, the lines formed, they had to wait for the backup plans, and it created a lot of chaos. 40,000 people had to cast provisional ballots in Durham County. Was it a glitch? Was it something more? We don't know. The Durham County Board of Elections determined that they thought that it was a glitch and they didn't want to pursue further investigation with the FBI or Department of Homeland Security.
But Susan, when somebody, what happens? I mean, I come up, you go up to vote, and the poll book, the electronic poll book says you're not registered. Is that what happens?
No, what happened was that they were down across the county, so they didn't have any.
They didn't have any poll book at all?
Right, so we got reports that people were being told to go away and come back later until they had runners come in with paper poll books that they could use. They would send one poll book, one paper poll book to each polling location. But in addition to the so now you have a line, and instead of having maybe 3 poll books to check people in, you have 1 paper book, and you have to go through it, so the lines are getting longer. But in addition, there was another problem, because you need to sign something called an authorization to vote form, which is a short statement of the voter affirming their own eligibility to vote. And that typically comes up in the poll book. So, when you're signing your name. So that's down also. So in addition to needing paper poll books, they needed authorization to vote forms. So we heard of other locations where they ran out of authorization to vote forms. They had to send people out to make copies. While they were making copies, they stopped voting again. So that type of denial of service attack can be very disruptive to people's ability to vote on election day, whether it's a software glitch or malicious hacking. And it was borne out in Durham on election day.
So I want to come back in a little while to these challenges and threats we have, but I want to go back to a point that both Kimberly and Susan made about that the Russians were behind this. So Damien, what evidence is there that Russia was behind some of the DNC and the Hillary Rodham Clinton campaigns, email attacks, and then since the delivery mechanism for this was WikiLeaks, what's the connection between Russia and WikiLeaks, if there is one?
Well, there's lots of evidence. It's all circumstantial, but there is lots of evidence. That since it's circumstantial, I wouldn't go as far as saying that we're certain that it was Russia all from that hacked the DNC and that provided the contents of the emails to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks has always had a very ambivalent position on its sources. Initially, they claimed that their whole system was built to prevent them from knowing who was giving them information, which was a very smart system, because if you don't know who gave you the information, you can't betray them. And the people will tend to give you more information because they will be sure that they will never be prosecuted and that they can't be found. But in recent years, at some points, Julian Assange has hinted at the fact that he knew who was giving him information in some cases. And in the case of the DNC emails, he claimed that it was not Russia. He did not phrase it exactly like this, but he said that it was not Russia. So I'm not going to take his word for it, but I can't say for certain that the documents he got from Russia. Maybe he got it from Russia through a middleman. Maybe he got it from Russia directly. Maybe he did not get it from Russia. Maybe he thinks he did not get it from Russia, but he did. In computer security, the most difficult thing to do is attribution. It's very easy to mask your traces. It's very easy to mask the traces and to leave traces that will let anybody who comes looking up after that he was another actor. You can almost never be 100% certain that this actor was behind this attack. This said, in this case, you have a lot of circumstantial evidence that point towards the direction of Russia. So.
And then what about then the connection to WikiLeaks? Is there a...
It's complicated.
Because I want to bring this also, Kimberly, and after this
Sure.
on the DC leaks release of it and Gucci for 2.0 and others that are other mechanisms of this release.
Well, as you may know, WikiLeaks is 10 years old this year. Historically, they've not been good friends with Russia. They published some documents about Russia. They did not show any enthusiasm towards Russia until very recently. This said, they've had some dealings with Russia directly. Julian Assange had a show on Russia Today for a while. When Edward Snowden had to leave Hong Kong, it was WikiLeaks who acted as the middleman to get into Russia safely. It was Sarah Harrison, who works for WikiLeaks full-time, almost full-time, who arranged the transition and made sure he got a lawyer and that he could settle there. So they have contacts in Russia. They have people who like what they're doing in Russia, obviously. And as we've seen about what happened in Ukraine, there's a strong tie between what Russian media say and publish and what WikiLeaks does. RT has been covering very, very heavily the DNC email scandals. They've been covering very, very heavily everything about WikiLeaks, every revelation, everything regarding Julian Assange's personal situation. So they have some friends there, at least in the media, that's a safe bet. And possibly stronger ties with people there, but that's not to say that they have a direct line to the Kremlin. This is maybe a bit far-fetched.
Well, anything you want to add on to that?
Sure. My understanding is that the pattern that was followed in the kind of software that was used fits very closely what Fancy
That's
Bear
true.
and Cozy Bear are known to have done other places. So if somebody was faking that it was Fancy Bear or Cozy Bear, they had to have a great deal of information and put a great deal of time into faking the pattern. And then when you look at the result, Putin doesn't, even though he has, officially said there's no evidence, He has also implied that this might be retaliation for U.S. involvement in both the Russian protests in 2011, 2012, and then in the Euromaidan in Ukraine in early 2014. Other Russian experts have said that they see it as that the way it's always couched is, we don't know whether Russia was responsible, but if Russia was responsible then, that it might be in retaliation for the Panama Papers, which many people in Russia believe was actually a CIA operation.
That's good. That's good to know because Le Monde worked on the Panama paper, and I haven't seen anybody from the CIA, so maybe I missed something.
Yeah, if anybody who sort of looked at the Panama Papers release, I mean, it seems to be so much private actors and a variety of private actors coming together. It's not like a typical CIA plot, but you know, if you're from the KGB, if you're from Russia, the CIA is responsible for everything, right?
So, I mean, so these different parts, right, that it's not new per se, right, to try to influence both the information or the means or shape to try to get there. What is new about this, though, in 2016? So the Tsarist period, the Soviet period, right, Russia tried to influence, or the Soviet Union did. Tsarist Russia tried to influence other things that were going on around the world with propaganda, whether it was the Protocols of Elders of Zion to shape different things. Not saying around here that it was about that, but propaganda is something that the Russians do and spread for centuries, right? And so what's new, though, today, if Russia is the principal actor we're concerned with now, what's new about this then?
Even on fake news, Russia has done this forever. In Soviet times, it was not uncommon for there to be false documents put forward as if they were released from the archives or as if they were released from a classified source. And then, of course, it's very hard for the U.S. government to say, no, this supposedly classified document that's been released isn't actually accurate, because how can you disavow a document that's still supposed to be classified? So that pattern of putting forth fake news, of trying to influence everything from policy decisions to electoral support is not new at all. And I would say the only thing that's new is the technology. And it's not surprising that Russia would be good at it, because we know from Soviet times they had some of the best software engineers. It was Soviet hardware that couldn't keep up with U.S. and other international hardware developments, but their software engineers were always superb. And the one thing going forward that's going to be very interesting to see is whether they can hang on to these software engineers, whether they can hang on to these patriotic hackers. Because for one thing, they're running out of money, and so they have to put their priorities in some places over others. But in the other, if you think about who is in the hacker community, it tends to be people who are very individualistic, and we might even call them, people who are sort of in some ways odd. They're people who are sort of proud to be separate from the mainstream community. That doesn't go very far in Russia if you're working inside of, an FSB bureaucracy. And so whether they can come to terms with the individualism of the people that they need to work for them when they're anti-liberal in all of their political theorizing is going to be interesting to see.
So then these new means of technology then, right? So these info wars have really been happening, right? It's a new term, but they've been doing this art of info wars in combination for a long time. Technologically then, though, Susan, what can you do about it, right? In the sense of, if they're so evolved and have some of the best software engineers that are there, and the same pattern of behavior between seeing Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear involved in these patterns of behavior, what can be done to protect the electoral systems from such a well-funded actor that if they do have a motive to want to influence, what can be done to protect that, especially if it's locals and communities and states that have to pay for these processes and do the audits that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a challenge because elections are, I would argue, there's no doubt they're a national security issue, but they're run on the local level by local county clerks who very often are not technologically savvy or familiar with computer hygiene or two-factor authentication even. And for a long time, election administration wasn't really a computer issue to begin with because we were using lever machines or something else that wasn't, punch cards is not computerized or minimally computerized. So election officials are very siloed, and this is something that we found is that a lot of election officials don't have a lot of contact with their state CIOs or CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, where the Chief Information Security Officers these days now go around with their hair on fire every other day because they're afraid that their state DMV database is going to be locked up with ransomware, and they are really understanding how international the cyber threat is to everything that they do. But election officials have been blissfully unaware of that for a really long time. So how do we bridge that gap and have the type of fortified security system on our voting computers that we have on our banking computers? And I don't really know if there's an easy path to that, because that costs a lot of money, and right now there's no money. We have our voting systems in general are quite old. After the 2000 Bush v. Gore recount, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act in 2002 and appropriated billions of dollars for new voting equipment, which was then purchased and adopted over the next few years, most of it by 2006, which is now about 10 years old. And in computer land, that's ancient, that's a dinosaur. And the bottom line is that computers are vulnerable to malfunctions, to programming errors, to software bugs, and to hacking, malicious hacking. So our organization takes the position that we want a system that the devil himself could run and you can still trust the results. And that would be a system where there's, and that's what we need, a paper ballot that the voter marks and can confirm their voter intent on a piece of paper, which is human readable. In the US, there's two main types of voting systems. One is a paper ballot marked by the voter and then run through an optical scanner, which, you fill in the bubble or so, and like we have in New York, and then it's counted through an optical scanner, which is a computer, but you do have an independent record of the voter's intent, which is completely independent of software. And then we also have what's called direct record electronic, or DREs, or typically referred to as touch screens, where the voter records their vote electronically on the equipment, and then it's counted from that electronic record. The problem with an electronic record is that that can be manipulated by some sort of software or bug or software error and lost. And there's no way where you can go back and have the original record of voter intent that the voter was able to confirm was correct. Because we vote anonymously, you can't go back to the voter and say, this is what the computer said you voted when you voted at 10:41. Is that actually how you voted? There's no way to know that. But when you have a voter verified paper record, you have an opportunity to confirm voter intent independently of the computer. And then to audit those results, to always do a post-election audit of a random sample of the computerized vote tally versus the paper ballots, to ensure that that computer is counting the votes correctly and that there's no malicious software, there's no programming error, there's no bug. If we had these types of post-election audits, I think there would be greater voter confidence, and there wouldn't be a need to be looking at the vote totals or the paper ballots in Wisconsin or Michigan, because this would be happening automatically. You wouldn't need somebody to sue for it and require that it go forward. We would be regularly, automatically, in a nonpartisan way, without claims of sour grapes or some other nefarious motivation, driving the audits. It would be routine. And New York State does have such audits. Some states do, like California, Florida. They vary in their robustness, but there's a movement to spreading this across the country, in which we're hoping to advocate for. But would be the system that we would think would be the best way to protect
So
our
from a
vote choices.
policy perspective, then, do you think then for the areas of critical infrastructure that are classified under your cybersecurity framework, that there's 15 sectors that are under critical infrastructure, that the Department of Homeland Security is responsible, and there's sector-specific agencies, for example, financial service sector, transportation sector, energy sector, the electrical grid? Should the electoral systems be included as part of the American critical infrastructure? And if so, who should be responsible for overseeing that from the federal government or engaging on that process?
Yeah, so in 2013, when the National Institute of Standards and Technology was beginning to develop a framework for critical infrastructure cybersecurity in the U.S., Verified Voting actually submitted public comments arguing that our election system should be considered part of critical infrastructure. And the Secretary of State of Minnesota did, and a few other stakeholders and individuals. But in general, it fell on deaf ears and was not. Until what happened this summer when we started to see the hacking into the voter registration databases and the voting system vendor and the DNC emails, and Secretary Jay Johnson of Department of Homeland Security floated the idea, should election systems be part of critical infrastructure? And Department of Homeland Security began to offer its services to election officials if they wanted to shore up the security of their systems, because they were identifying threats against the voting machines and the voting systems in general, the other ancillary parts, voter registration databases, e-poll books, etc. There was a very vocal backlash by some secretaries of state who saw this as federal government overreach. And the Department of Homeland Security sort of backed away and said, we can offer you all the services that you would get as critical infrastructure without designating this as critical infrastructure if people are worried about the title. And so they have tried to make all their resources available to the county and state election officials without that designation, because it then became a political football, which doesn't get us anywhere when that kind of thing happens. So I think it still would be a good idea if we could do it without it becoming a point of contention.
Coming back to the InfoWars, where we started off from that piece of where Kimberly brought in and talking the technology side, as an InfoWar standpoint, Damien, is WikiLeaks a platform for information warfare? And from there, even platforms like WikiLeaks or anything else, and what is Julian, we talked a little bit about Vladimir Putin's motives, or what potential motives can be, and little misunderstandings as well. What are Julian Assange's motives with WikiLeaks, or its involvement with, especially America?
That's a very good question. They're a platform for warfare, as any media may be a platform for warfare. One thing that Julian Assange has said repeatedly, and that I truly believe, is that if they had gotten interesting information about the Trump campaign, they would have published it, no question asked. They thrive when they publish. They need to publish, and it's something that both ideologically and functionally they need to do, because if WikiLeaks stop publishing for a month, 2 months, 3 months, the supports dry out, the money dries out, because they rely on donations from their supporters. So they need to publish it, they need to keep getting new scoops. So that's one powerful driver.